So hello everyone and welcome to our Study of Religions research seminar here in University College Cork. I'm delighted to introduce Danny Forde, who's going to talk to us about psychedelic realism, phenomenology of psychedelic experiences. Danny is a PhD candidate in UCC under the supervision of Dr. Alessandro Salice. He has presented his work at University College Dublin, UCC, the British Society for Phenomenology, the Insight Conference in Berlin, and at the Irish Philosophical Society. His areas of interest include realist phenomenology, Platonism, mystical experience, and Spinoza. So I know there's a lot of interest in your topic, Danny, so I'll hand it over to you. So you have to unmute yourself, Danny.
Okay, now, can you hear me now? Okay, sorry about that false start. We'll try that again. So yeah, thank you very much. Sorry. Okay, we're off to a good start. Thanks to the religion department for giving me this opportunity to talk about my work. It's always fun when I get to present this work because I always get some interesting feedback, and it's a topic that a lot of people find interesting, or I've found that anyway so far. So anyway, there's a lot to get through, so I'll stop talking nonsense. So yes, psychedelic realism is the kind of main claim of my thesis. So look, yeah, let's just move on to the next slide. So here's the rough plan for today. So first, I'll define what psychedelic realism is, so we have some sort of background as to what I'm getting at. Then I'll give a little bit of background and motivation, and I'll offer some theoretical grounding. Now, in my dissertation, there's kind of four interlocking claims. So one is that a minimal self is maintained during the phenomenon of ego-dissolution. The second claim is that this grants access to what I call ego-free seeing. The third claim is that psychedelics open the subject to the essential nature of reality. By essential here, I mean like the Platonic essences. And the fourth claim then is that these are bona fide transformative and mystical experiences. So obviously to go through all four of those claims in any sort of meaningful way would require probably quite a few hours. So I'm just going to focus on the one highlighted in red, but I will address all four claims to one degree or another as we go through. So let's get started properly. So psychedelic realism. So this is the claim that sorry, I'm hoping I don't get assaulted by a cat during this. Psychedelic experiences feel more real than real because they do in fact disclose mind-independent features of reality and offers the subject a direct apprehension of what the mystics would call the ground of being. So yeah, just this isn't something I set out to prove when I started doing my PhD. Perhaps maybe naively, I thought I was just going to do a straightforward description of what psychedelic experiences entail, but this is where phenomenology led me. So here we are. So a little bit of background first, just to sort of define the subject area. So I'm focusing mainly on classical psychedelics, which would be psilocybin, the active, or one of the, probably the most important active ingredient in what's commonly referred to as magic mushrooms, LSD then, also known as acid, mescaline, the active compound in the peyote cactus, also in the San Pedro cactus in South America, and then dimethyltryptamine. Now, I have been focusing on primarily psychedelic use within a specific setting of the therapeutic research that's been going on for the last few years. So I'm not really taking into account just, random psychedelic experiences, although I'm sure my findings will also apply to experiences taking in, not very well controlled settings. So, okay, first, what do psychedelics do? They cause profound changes to perception, emotion, cognition, experience of time and space, and perhaps most importantly, then your sense of self. So effects are highly variable and very strongly influenced by what's called set and setting. So set here refers to the subject's psychological state of mind, essentially, whether you're depressed, whether you're happy, and so on and so forth. So how you're feeling essentially going into the experience. And then the setting refers to the physical environment in which the experience is taking place. So yeah, these were studied. Obviously, the use of psychedelics stretches back to prehistory. They were studied as psychiatric treatments in the 50s and 60s until psychedelics escaped to the lab, and Nixon sort of shut everything down in 1970. But humans have been using psychedelics since. I believe the oldest recorded use is there's some rock art in Tassili, which I believe is in Algeria, which is roughly from 6000 BC. But I believe there's some recorded use of mescaline in South America, which predates that. So the only things with longer recorded use among humans is beer and cannabis. So we've been using psychedelics for a long time. So as I was saying, Nixon shut everything down in the 70s, and then since there was kind of inklings of stuff happening in the 90s, and then in the early 2000s, there was like a real kind of resurgence in empirical studies into the psychedelic experience. So there was a new wave of research that shows that psychedelics can be administered safely in controlled conditions to suitably prepared volunteers, both healthy volunteers and patients with anxiety, depression, and addiction. So it's what I'm focusing on in my thesis is psychedelics used in these carefully controlled situations where the person is going into the experience with, maybe several weeks of preparation with a psychotherapist, and that during the experience itself, there is, a minimum of two people there, the psychotherapist and usually a doctor or a nurse as well. And then perhaps as important as set and setting is the setting of intentions leading into the experience. And then afterwards is the integration of the experience in order to maximize the potential positive benefits, therapeutic benefits that one can reap from a psychedelic experience. So in terms of philosophy, this is very much a nascent area of rigorous philosophical inquiry. There's been bits and pieces over the years. I mean, perhaps most famously, there's Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception, which is more of an account rather than a rigorous philosophical examination of the psychedelic experience. And then in recent years, there's been Chris Leatherby's book, Philosophy of Psychedelics, which I believe came out 2 years. I think it was 2020 it came out. And then last year there was a collection of essays. I think it's called Philosophy and Psychedelics is the name of the book, by Professor Christine Hauskeller and Dr. Peter Sjøsted Hughes, who are both based in the UK. But aside from that, there hasn't been a whole lot. So one aim of my thesis is to try to, there is no proper rigorous phenomenological examination of the psychedelic experience. So I'm trying to fill that gap in the literature. So let me see, where are we? Okay, so this Michael Pollan, his book, How to Change Your Mind, excellent book, came out in 2018, I think. But he poses a question. I think this question was actually posed.
Is Danny breaking up for other people, or is it my internet?
He's also broken up for me. Yeah.
Absolutely for me as well. Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah, no.
yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah,
hopefully he'll. I think he's coming back now.
Okay, sorry about that, guys. Is it working okay again now?
Yeah. Sorry, Danny. I was just asking people because I wasn't sure if it was my internet or yours.
No, it's probably mine. I'm way out in the sticks, so yeah, it's definitely me. Okay, I'll try to speak slowly so it makes sense.
The last thing we heard was he poses a question, and then you went
yes.
up.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Thank you very much. So yeah, he poses this question when he was talking about the benefits of psychedelic therapy, but then he has this worry that is psychedelic therapy simply foisting a comforting delusion on the sick and dying, because people often report or commensurate with positive outcomes from psychedelic experiences is the mystical experience, and the mystical experience from the standpoint of, say, scientific materialism is problematic. So he's asking this question, you know, is it are what people experiencing, is it just a delusion that's comforting, and is that something we should be concerned about? So that question is what Chris Leatherby in his book calls the comforting delusion objection, which is a potential objection to the use of psychedelics as a therapeutic adjunct. And he phrases it like this. He says, psychedelics induce their salutary psychological effects mainly by inducing metaphysical beliefs that are comforting but probably false. And we should therefore hesitate to use these substances for therapeutic or transformative purposes. So that's the comforting delusion objection. So we'll kind of talk through this a little bit more, and then we'll kind of get a foothold. So yeah, he mentions metaphysical beliefs. So just to give everyone an idea, because I'm not going to assume everyone's familiar with what a psychedelic experience is like. This is what the sort of metaphysical beliefs. So this is from an excellent paper by Christine Preller and Franz Vollenweider. And this is specifically talking about the peak of the psychedelic experience. So along with the increasing dissolution of the ego, the psychedelic experience can peak in a state where subjects can become immersed for seconds or minutes in a profound awareness of oneness, in which all boundaries disappear and objects are unified into a totality. When subjects have their eyes open, they retrospectively describe the state as an intense, emotionally charged, new and unfamiliar perspective, almost like a direct encounter with the ultimate reality, which can inspire feelings of awe, sacredness, and eternity. This novel experience is also characterized by a pervasive sense of deep insight into the nature and structure of the universe that is far beyond the person's usual mode of thinking. This intuitive awareness of unity appears to resemble the quality of suchness, as described in states of awakening and advanced Zen meditation, or as reported in the so-called extrovertive type of mystical states. So that's just to give you an idea of the sort of metaphysical beliefs that psychedelics tend to produce in individuals. So now we can go back to the comforting delusion objection. So this is how Chris Leatherby formulates the objection. So the first premise is that naturalism is true. I'll try to define naturalism in a minute, because it's a tricky word. The second premise, if the epistemic status of psychedelic therapy is poor, then we should hesitate to recommend or prescribe psychedelics. Premise 3, if naturalism is true, then the epistemic status of psychedelic therapy is poor, and therefore, conclusion, we should hesitate to recommend or prescribe psychedelic therapy. So that's the comforting delusion objection. So there's possible responses. One, okay, I'll talk about naturalism here. I'll come back to it again in a second. So naturalism, especially in the world of philosophy, is a very slippery notion, because it can mean different things depending on the philosopher you're talking about. So specifically in this context, Chris Leatherby, I describe his naturalism more as scientific materialism. So for him, this naturalism that he's referring to here is the idea that the only world that exists is the one that can be described by the natural sciences, and external reality is essentially comprised of non-minded physical stuff. So it's very much a scientific materialist approach to the natural world. So I'll go through the possible responses to the comforting delusion. So the first one, you can reject naturalism. You can say naturalism is false. There is no delusion, and the ultimate reality or ground of being revealed in the psychedelic experience is in fact real. Your second option is you can reject the second premise. And you can say, look, naturalism is true, but the positive benefits of psychedelic therapy outweigh the epistemic costs. So it's a naturalistic point of view that's trying to be just, entirely pragmatic. So it doesn't matter if what people believe is false, if it's helping people. Third option, you can accept the conclusion. You can say that, yeah, psychedelics are too epistemically costly and we should be careful about using them. Or the fourth option is you can reject premise 3, which is Chris Leatherby's original contribution. And he says, you can advocate for that scientific materialist approach to naturalism and argue that psychedelics still have significant epistemic value. So those are 4 possible options. And the one I chose is to reject the first premise and say that that specific type of naturalism is false, and that psychedelics do, in fact, reveal what the mystics would call the ground of being. So that's, excuse me. So we'll do a very brief refutation of naturalism, or scientific materialism, to be more specific. So, oh yeah, this is one of my favorite quotes in all of philosophy, where Edmund Husserl, one of the early founders of phenomenology, referred to naturalism and psychologism as a sin against the Holy Spirit of philosophy. All right, okay, this would be too much of a tangent to go through exactly what psychologism is, but essentially psychologism is the idea that the laws of logic can be purely explained in terms of psychology, which Husserl rejects, because if you want to do biology or chemistry or physics, then you need the laws of logic, you need, the Pythagorean theorem, you need mathematics. But chemistry, physics, or biology cannot account or explain where these logical laws come from. So you need some sort of Husserl essentially sort of, well, I won't give Husserl all the credit, but he's very responsible for bringing back a form of Platonism in order to account for mathematical laws, and therefore, you're also opening the doors for other Platonic essences then as well. So naturalism is self-refuting if you take into account Husserl's anti-psychologism. And then furthermore, yeah, this is from an excellent article by Frank, Gleiser, and Thompson, which I believe is being turned into a book, which should be out next year, called The Blind Spot of Science. And very simply, they argue that the natural sciences can account for everything external to our minds, but they can't account for subjectivity. So in the blind spot of science, there is experience, which is the sheer presence and immediacy of lived perception, which is quite an important blind spot, I would argue, if you can't account for subjectivity. So that's where phenomenology comes in. If naturalism is incomplete, then you need an approach whose speciality is dealing with, first personal subjectivity, just experience. So that's what's the entire focus of phenomenology. So the blind spot can be filled by phenomenology. So yeah, okay. And then one of the most important concepts within phenomenology then is this idea of intentionality, which just refers to the aboutness of mental states. So when you're having any experience, there's a subject, obviously, who's having the experience. There's the mode of givenness, which I'll say much more about because that's going to be the main focus of the presentation. And then there's the object, which is just the thing towards which you're directed. So, for example, right now, I'm having an intentional act. I'm a subject. I have this intentional mode where I'm perceiving, and the object that I'm perceiving is this laptop in front of me. So I took this subject, mode, and object as the core chapters of my my thesis. So obviously, I'm only going to focus on one of them today. So, okay, I need to just very briefly digress to discuss ego-dissolution because it plays a very important role in, yeah, not just in the psychedelic experience, but in my analysis of the psychedelic experience too. So in ordinary states of consciousness, our ego dominates and dictates our being in the world. I'll define what I mean by ego as well in a couple of slides' time. So I use the term ego to refer to, actually I define it right here, I'm ahead of myself, excellent. So I use the term ego here to refer to our sense of being an individual with a specific autobiography, with specific wants and fears and desires and hopes and predilections and so on and so forth. So this ego shapes not only how we interact with the world and how we conduct ourselves, but it also directly affects how we perceive reality itself. Yeah, and I argue that the temporary dissolution of the ego by psychedelic offers the subject a radically new perspective on both the self and on reality. So now we'll start getting into the sort of 4 interlocked main claims that I make. So the first one is that a minimal self is maintained during ego dissolution. So some contemporary theories have sought to explain the phenomenon of ego dissolution by adopting a self-modeling or an eliminativist approach to the self. So according to these accounts, the self is taken to be just a representation generated by the mind in order to organize and integrate information across cognitive modalities. And then they claim that psychedelic dissolution or psychedelic self-dissolution, which I think is a misnomer, lends credence to this no self view. But are these authors working with a phenomenologically accurate account of the self? I don't think so. I think the self is too complex a concept to be captured pure or to be accounted for purely as just a representation. So instead, or as counterpoint, I offer a multidimensional account of the self, which includes subjectivity, the ego, and self. So the self, as I use the term here anyway, is the psychophysical totality of what the individual is. And included within the self then is subjectivity, which can also be referred to as for-me-ness or the minimal self, which is just the bare givenness of experience. And then on top of that, there's the ego, which is more ordinary narrative conception of ourselves and who we are. So yeah, that's my account of the self. So then I argue that which dissolves in these peak psychedelic experiences is not the self, but it's just the ego or ordinary understandings of who we are. The essential features of ego dissolution include a distorted sense of time and a lost sense of individuality. There's this sense of oneness with the totality of being. So the dissolution of these features buckles the girders of the narrative arc that the ego is reliant upon, because an ego needs time in which to operate, and if you've no felt sense of time, then your ego cannot be maintained. However, these experiences of ego dissolution are all experiences for someone, so they exemplify for-me-ness. So a minimal self is there to undergo the experience. That's how the people can report these experiences after the fact. So a minimal self endures even the most turbulent of psychedelic experiences, as you can't have an experience without there being an experiencer. So therefore, subjectivity is maintained. So that's how I rescued the idea of the self from the clutches of the eliminativists and scientific materialists. So that's the first claim, and I will start getting into the second claim. So now we'll start talking about the intentional mode or the mode of givenness. Okay, so yeah, in this section then I'm trying to dissolve an apparent tension. So psychedelics are often considered to cause hallucinations, but very common feature of psychedelic experiences is what's called the noetic quality, which is a term that just comes from William James's analysis of mystical experiences, and just refers to the fact that these experiences feel more real than real, is a phrase that's often repeated, but they feel, deeply meaningful, poignant, and significant, like very significant. So I argue that rather than being purely hallucinatory, the psychedelic experience can in fact reveal aspects of reality which would not otherwise be disclosed. So as the ego dissolves, one gains a view of the world which I call ego-free seeing. And I'll probably spend the next maybe, I'm eating up time pretty quickly. This will be the main focus that I'll work through in the next 15 minutes roughly. So firstly, I'll spell out what an intentional mode is. So the intentional mode just refers to the way in which objects are given in phenomenal consciousness. So typical examples include thought is an intentional mode, hoping is an intentional mode, desire is an intentional mode, but my focus is entirely upon perception. And there's two reasons for that. One, it's a handy contrast to hallucination. They're considered to be opposites. And secondly, in the history of phenomenology, perception is seen as our primary mode of being in the world. Have I skipped? Oh, I haven't. Pardon me. So, just before I move on to the next slide, just to qualify what I mean by perception specifically. So I don't mean just, sensorial input of the external world, but I mean, I refer to like inner perceptions as well, kinesthesia, somatic perception, anything that where you can, reasonably and rationally use the word I perceive, X. So it's not just, with your eyes, you perceive sounds, you perceive tastes, and so on and so forth. So I kind of mean perception in kind of a broader sense. So first I have to give an account of what perception is. And I think perception is affected by our hopes, our desires, our plans, our beliefs, our actions. Yeah, and I have this quote from Burdyev. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself now. So the idea is that, so the idea is that perception is just representation, or just it's more than just what's sensorially offered to you through your senses, but there's you also perceive abstract qualities of things in the external world. For example, when I see my water bottle, I don't just perceive a bottle, but I also perceive, the utility of the bottle. So which would be an abstract property of the bottle itself. So here's a quote from the Russian philosopher Nikolai Burdyev. By its most profound nature, perception cannot only be an obedient reflection of reality or an adaptation to the data at hand, but is also an active transfiguration giving meaning to being. Which is to say that, you see more than just what your senses offer. There's abstract properties of the concrete particulars that make up reality are also given to you. So this is just what in philosophy you call, you say that perception is cognitively penetrated. Okay, and so I use a further distinction then, or well, not distinction, but refinement of cognitive penetration. Because if you were to say that not now. Sorry, there's a cat harassing me. If you were to say that all perception is cognitively penetrated, then on a very harsh reading of that, people could argue that, well, you can't see anything that you don't have the concept for. So in order to mitigate that and to differentiate, I use Fred Dretski's distinction between epistemic seeing and non-epistemic seeing. So non-epistemic seeing is manifested in every visual experience. It's a prediscursive, pre-intellectual capacity, which is immune to the vagaries of our intellectual life. So, i.e., non-epistemic seeing is not cognitively penetrated. So I think Dretski gives the example of I think he talks about his cocker spaniel and his cat, that they perceive the world non-epistemically. They don't have, or as far as we're aware anyway, they don't have the rich epistemic concepts that they can apply to the things in the world. And then conversely, epistemic seeing is cognitively penetrated and is formed by, amongst other things, our metaphysical, our cultural, and our sociological beliefs. So non-epistemic seeing is a ubiquitous feature of all seeing, and therefore epistemic seeing is grounded or presupposes non-epistemic seeing. So you can have an experience of non-epistemic seeing without epistemic seeing, but not vice versa. Yeah, I won't dwell on that too much longer. I'll come back to it later on. It's not, yeah, we just need this quick summary now of perception so I can keep going. So perception is essentially direct. When I perceive the world, I'm perceiving the world out here. It's not a representation generated by my brain. When I perceive the laptop, it's this laptop, not a representation of it. It comprises a much richer and complex contextualization than just captured through the senses. So when we perceive, our impressions are saturated by affordances. So an affordance is comes from the philosopher Gibson, which again is just his word for the abstract properties that you perceive of things. So like if you meet an angry dog on a laneway, you'll look around your environment and you'll immediately perceive, you know, the durability of a stick or the hitability of a stone or something like that. Horizontal intentionality and perception is quite often, not always, but quite often, cognitively penetrated. So Tversky's distinction gives me a useful conceptual framework to distinguish between, you know, the elements of what we perceive that's cognitively penetrated and elements that are not. So how does this? Okay, so that's the account of perception. So now we need to figure out the other side of the coin. What are psychedelic hallucinations like? Now, in the literature on, or in the pre-existing literature, I should say, on hallucination in the psychedelic experience, there's kind of three broad categories. There's elementary, complex, and metaphysical. And I'll go through these one by one quickly. So elementary hallucinations just refers to the permeation of the visual field with intricate patterns, essentially. And now, so Heinrich Kluver carried out the first kind of systematic analysis of these geometric figures in the 20s by administering subjects and himself back in the good old days when the scientists' first port of call for experimentation was themselves. So all of his research involved peyote. And Kluver found with remarkable invariancy four distinct recurring themes of lattices, cobwebs, tunnels, and spirals. So these elementary hallucinations, they're essentially the first sort of the first type of hallucinations to start, or the earliest to show up in a psychedelic experience, and they tend to persist throughout the experience. So that's elementary. And then we have complex. And that refers to the perception of individuals, natural scenes, animals, entities, landscapes, architecture. These hallucinations are generally comprised of non-repetitive, figurative visual features, and they transport more semantic content typically than elementary hallucinations. So this obviously will occur, you know, later on in the psychedelic experience. So that's complex hallucinations, and then metaphysical hallucinations. So this was a term coined by philosopher Owen Flanagan. Now, it's a long quote, but I'll go through it very quickly. So metaphysical hallucinations involves having certain experiences, embracing how things seem while having those experiences, and then trying to imaginatively project oneself into a world in which the relevant experiences or thoughts seem as real can be, as worthwhile can be, and are thus spirit constituting and action guiding. They involve working one's way into a certain kind of strong noetic confidence that reveals itself in how one experiences and lives one's life. One comes to think that a hallucinated attitude toward reality is worth adopting, and then one tries to make it the way things seem while hallucinating. So The noetic confidence attaches perhaps not to believing that things are in fact such and so, although it might involve some of that, but wanting the world to be a certain way, a way one experiences as good, better, or excellent. Yeah, it's a very long and complicated quote, and I think Flanagan's a little. He seems to think the noetic quality is, added on after the experience, but reports from everyone who's had, or essentially everyone has had a psychedelic experience, the noetic quality is, within the experience. It's not something that you reflect on afterwards. And the main criticism then that I have of him is that like calling these metaphysical hallucinations is kind of an assertion resting on an assumption. I think Flanagan's committed to a scientific materialist point of view, whereas if you think the sort of metaphysical beliefs brought about by psychedelic experience are hallucinations, then obviously you're going to call them metaphysical hallucinations. But again, I think that's just an assertion resting on an assumption. So yeah, okay, there's been a little bit of empirical research into this sort of metaphysical beliefs caused by psychedelics. This is from Chris Timmerman, who does a lot of research with 5-MeO-DMT, mostly based out of London. So this is from a paper called, I think the title of the paper is actually Psychedelics Alter Metaphysical Beliefs. So he found that results revealed significant shifts away from physicalist or materialist views and towards panpsychism and fatalism post-use. And these changes remained detectable at 6 months and were associated with the extent of past use and improved mental health outcomes. These findings imply that psychedelic use has a causal influence on metaphysical beliefs, shifting them away from hard materialism, which would be, the sort of metaphysical belief that Chris Letheby was endorsing. So, all right, I'll try to start winding up a little bit to get to some sort of resolution. So, pardon me. So what aspects of the experience are perceptual? Because I said at the start that I think certain elements are perceptual. So what aspects are veridical? Yes, because this famous line from Blake, which is often used in association with psychedelics, if the doors of perception were cleansed, then everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. So I'll start trying to make sense of that in light of psychedelics. So in phenomenological terms, then, Merleau-Ponty, in his late and unfortunately unfinished work, because he died while he was writing this, he put forward this idea of wild being. And he asks, how can one return from this perception fashioned by culture to the brute or wild perception? What does the informing of culture consist in? By what act does one undo it and return to the phenomenal, to the vertical world, to lived experience? And so I would argue that the act by which one undoes this is through a psychedelic act. So I argue here, obviously, just as a prelude, obviously, I think, the category of elementary hallucinations, I don't think that's perceptual. I think that's, genuinely hallucinatory. I don't think you're perceiving mind-independent features when you're seeing lattices and spirals out there in the world. But I think the experience does offer a view from, not from nowhere, but a view from know who. So as the ego begins to dissolve, the perceptual structures and strictures that the ego ordinarily imposes on the world also dissolves commensurately. So here's a little quote from Huxley to sort of elaborate on what I mean there. He says that mescaline allowed him to be shaken out of the ruts of ordinary perception and to be shown for a few timeless hours the outer and the inner world, not as they appear to an animal obsessed with survival or to a human being obsessed with notions and words, but as they are apprehended directly and unconditionally by mind at large. So psychedelics permit a view temporarily freed from the bounds of the utilitarian concerns, which are driven by, the subject-object dichotomy that ordinarily pervades perception with pragmatism. So, if you ordinarily look, if you pass a vase of flowers somewhere you won't pay much attention to it because it's not of any pragmatic use to your ego as you're going about your day. But Huxley famously saw in a vase of flowers, he said he was seeing what Adam had seen on the morning of creation, the moment, or the miracle moment by moment of naked existence. So how do I make sense of this in terms of perception? So I think it's increased non-epistemic seeing. So again, quote from Huxley, visual impressions are greatly intensified and the eye recovers some of the perceptual innocence of childhood when the sensum was not immediately and automatically subordinated to the concept. So Huxley here is kind of neatly describing the idea of cognitive penetration, and that, you know, ordinarily we impose concepts upon what we see, or the ego does. And what psychedelics do is they lessen this and give us a more sort of innocent view of the world. And here's a nice quote from Alison Gopnik, is a psychologist based in the US. Can't remember exactly where. So she says, it turns out that when adults dream or have psychedelic experiences, their brains are functioning more like children's brains. And it appears that the experience of babies and young children is more like dreaming or tripping than our usual grown-up consciousness. And she's got a funny line actually about if you want to have a psychedelic experience, just have a tea party with a bunch of 4-year-olds. And in my own experience, she's not entirely wrong. So what sort of seeing is involved? Non-epistemic seeing applies to the indescribable or the ineffable elements of psychedelic experience. But, you know, as Huxley was saying, you know, seeing what Adam saw on the moment of, or the morning of creation requires a concept. That's obviously not non-epistemic. So I think it's just that the epistemic content of that object has been stripped of what the ego imposes, and the sheer wonder just of its being can shine forth, or the platonic essences that composes, for example, the beauty of the flowers is directly perceivable by the subject undergoing the experience. Okay, so that's the end of claim 2, essentially. So that's ego-free seeing. And very quickly now, because I know we're running out of time. Okay, my third claim then is about the intentional objects. So that was all, I was discussing what's perceived with the eyes open, essentially. But what about complex hallucinations? What's going on there? Because quite a lot of the psychedelic experience is kind of a heroic journey through a mythopoetic landscape. So how do I make sense of that? So I claim that the mythopoetic archetypical phenomena encountered during the peak of the psychedelic experience are best comprehended in terms of essences. So these I ground in the idea of essentialism, or, you know, Jungian archetypes, because Jung was just, yeah, here's the quote from Jung: archetype is an explanatory paraphrase of the Platonic eidos, or the Platonic essences. So the best way to explain is just with a quick example. So in the psychedelic experience, say there's an intentional object. So you're perceiving something. For example, you say you perceive Odin. So there's the intentional object, there's the essence, which the symbol incarnates, or which the intentional object is just incarnating. So the symbol doesn't have actual existence, but the incarnated essence does in an ideal sense. So you're perceiving, or just as another example, say you have an encounter with Venus, for example, and what you're perceiving there is the essence of beauty. That's essentially the argument there. Ooh, okay, just a few more slides and then we're done. Okay, my last claim, this is very quick. It's just that these are bona fide transformative and mystical experiences. So yeah, the psychedelic experience is epistemically transformative. It's personally transformative. Oh yeah, and then I have a section where I talk about if you take Socrates at his word that the point of philosophy is to prepare for death and dying, because the psychedelic experience mimics the near-death experience, then psychedelics are potentially a very powerful tool for philosophizing. And then to show that the psychedelic experience is a bona fide or legitimate mystical experience, I appeal to Walter Terence Stace's principle of causal indifference, whereby if you've two reports with different causes. Say one, a mystical experience caused, on the natch, for example, and one caused by psychedelics, and you can't tell the two reports apart or which one is caused by which, then the cause doesn't matter, and they're both legitimate mystical experiences. So where does that leave us? I come back to Pollen and Lethaby. So remember, Pollen's question was, is psychedelic therapy simply foisting a comforting delusion on the sick and dying? I think not. I don't think there is any epistemic costs given, obviously the right context, the setting and integration as well. Because what you perceive is just reality devoid of subjectively imposed structures. The essence of reality is revealed once the fog of ego is lifted. There's plenty of options on the metaphysical menu, which can accommodate psychedelic experience without recourse to reduction or fictionalism or just mere pragmatism. Obviously, some aspects are technically hallucinatory. So, I don't think Terence McKenna's self-transforming machine elves have actual existence. But to consider the entirety of the psychedelic experience to be hallucinatory is like saying Moby Dick is just a book about whales. There's a lot more going on. And I think that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Danny. So we have some time for discussion and questions. So if people want to, you can raise your hand by the little symbol, pressing the little symbol there on your toolbar, or you can type in the chat. So you'll also have to unmute when you put up your hand. So I will, sorry, the first person there is Ludmilla, if I'm saying your name right.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Hi, Danny. Thank you so much for this extremely interesting presentation indeed. I mean, it was very deep and very complex and very sophisticated. Basically, I approached this topic as a person who had gone through the psychedelic experiences a lot myself. All the substances which you have shown on your slide, I actually tried them all. And I hope that all people who present at this session tried them, because otherwise I don't see any reason for presenting at this presentation. And your presentation is very philosophical, actually, and very, very profound. And I'm a qualitative researcher, actually. And my first question is, I understand you don't have any empirical data, so you didn't basically talk to anyone, you didn't get any perceptions of other people who were going through this whole thing. And what kind of practical implications do you think your research will basically have? Because this is a very important topic, and especially now when we are exposing to this AI problem. I guess that the most human response to AI is psychedelics, actually. So how do you perceive your practical importance of your research? How can it help to people who probably don't know what psychedelics are about? And
Practical implication. Well, I mean, I see the work as a starting point, essentially. I mean, there's so much work to be done to properly understand the psychedelic experience. But I think probably the most important thing that it does is it offers a counterpoint to the sort of scientific materialist worldview, which sort of dominates the empirical data that is coming out about psychedelics, which is all very positive, but I mean, because if you're a scientist, you have to say that's the mystical type experience. You can't, open the doors to mystical experiences and let them flood your scientific worldview. I think, firstly, it's the first proper phenomenological examination of psychedelic experiences. Secondly, it opens the door to because the scientific materialist approach has to say that it's useful. It's not reality revealing. Whereas I'm arguing that psychedelic experiences are actually reality revealing, and they reveal possibly the most important aspects of what it is to be human and what it is to be a human existing in the cosmos. Because I have a little section at the end where I discuss what the meaning of life is and the nature of the universe. But I mean, there's such big questions that are opened by this dissertation, such as what is the meaning of life? Why are we here? What's the nature of the cosmos? The dissertation also implies ideas like panpsychism, that mind and matter are one thing. So I mean, it's opening a lot of doors, and like I think it's the beginning of kind of a lifetime of research into the implications of the psychedelic experience.
Yes, I understand this because basically psychedelics are getting more popular at the moment, and even in the US, in many states, you can see that the psychotherapists got quite many legal experiences with psychedelics. I also have another question. Basically, my sister is now in Peru. She has been going through several sessions of ayahuasca, quite many of them actually already, about 30 or even more. And I know from her that you were quite clearly underlining that psychedelics are somehow very positive if we take them in controlled settings, and if everything is very professional and positive, and we have the mediator and so on and so forth. But particularly from my sister, for instance, this is not a scientific experience, but just a personal one. I know that people go to Peru, they take ayahuasca in very controlled settings with shamans, with cleaning their bodies all around. But basically, they come back to their countries, all kinds of countries, America, Spain, Russia, so on and so forth, and they actually have quite severe depressions because they cannot integrate the whole experience in their life. And you don't talk about that. From your presentation, it seems that psychedelics are very positive. They don't pose any kind of threat to people. And I understand that you approach the whole topic as a philosopher, not as a psychologist, not as a social scientist. I understand you are a philosopher. But don't you think that this may be a kind of limitation of this study? Because basically, even when you were showing these kind of complex trip and some light trip and some other stuff, these kind of things also they our mindset. I may have very complex mindset, and my trip will be very complex and very high, and I may go to the aliens, but on the other way around, I can be a very mundane, down to earth person, and my trip will be just the other way around. So I mean, the whole philosophical idea of psychedelics is very beautiful, but yet, don't you think that you also should try to show the probably evil side of psychedelics and how it can influence our psychic if we are not ready for that, when we are not ready to integrate or to live in very highly restricted social settings?
Yeah, no, okay, yeah, you make a very good point. And in my dissertation, like I stress the importance of setting and the context, especially in which psychedelics are taken. And I do mention the fact that just like so-called bad trips are very possible. But I also referred to some empirical studies which came out of I believe it's the Imperial College in London, which said that for the most part, with the right preparation, with the right set and setting, with the right guide, then bad experiences can all be almost entirely mitigated. And I also say that even in the most beautiful and the most positive psychedelic trips, there's always elements which are terrifying, which can set you off down, a very negative path during the experience. And that, hence the importance of what they call flight instructions given to the individual before the experience, classic, turn off your mind, relax, float downstream. If you see a window, look through it. If you see a door, open it. Remember you're somewhere safe, and and just the fact that, because I'm stressing as well that people, I'm only talking about psychedelics taken in that sort of controlled environment where there is weeks of preparation leading into it. That there is a psychologist, a trusted psychologist that you're familiar with, that there's a doctor and a nurse in the room as well who are helping you get through the experience. And then, as important as the experience itself, or this is what the empirical data is showing so far anyway, is the integration in the the days after, the weeks after, and even the months after, to maximize the positive benefits of the experience. But I do stress, several times in my dissertation, the importance of not doing it in a field, at a music festival, in a tent with some friends, but these chemicals should be treated with reverence, because they do have the potential to cause severe psychiatric problems if you're not going to use these things responsibly.
Yes, thank you for your answer. Actually, I didn't mean the whole the moment of taking psychedelics. What I mean is the moment of integrating the psychedelics in your life, because the session is one thing. What you do after the session is quite another thing.
Absolutely,
yeah. And the philosophy of this period of time is even more important than the philosophy of the moment of taking psychedelics inside. Actually, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I agree 100%. Yeah, it's something that needs to be studied more. There's one or two books, but not philosophically oriented. There's a few. I can't remember the chap's name, but there was a book that came out in the States, which is called Psychedelic Integration. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. I think it was Transform Press was the publisher. But as far as I'm aware, that's the only book specific to integration that has come out thus far.
Okay, thank you.
Danny,
I will give the word to Uffe. Thanks a lot.
Someone asked that you stop sharing your slide, I think, so we can see you better.
Oh, sure,
yeah. The next question is Uffe, if I'm pronouncing your name right.
Hello, and again, thank you for your presentation. It definitely had some very interesting points that I didn't take into consideration. I'm currently trying to write a chapter about the spiritual side of psychedelics, and I think in some of your arguments there's a little bit of a double standard. But correct me please if I'm wrong. Because on the one side you say that psychedelics actually reveal the true nature of things, and on the other hand you say that that these, for example, the machine elves, they do not exist. It's more like an archetype, like the beauty of Venus. I mean, this goes in my mind, towards, for example, the indigenous people, which communicate with the plant spirits. And for example, many of our modern medicines in the Western world have come directly from things we have learned from them, that they have found out by communicating with the plant spirits, and this whole thing is the spiritual world real, and does psychedelics make it possible for us to access into the spiritual world, or is it just an illusion? Is it what did you call it? These three letters, delusional. No, I forgot. But you had a very nice point about it. But it's the whole thing about, is it hallucination or is it not? Because definitely some of it is hallucinatory in its nature, but also like the nature of the DNA string was revealed through an LSD experience. So there's a little bit of double things there. But also I'm interested in this whole presentation, because I never heard about you before. And I understand from the other person making questions that you're a philosopher.
Yes.
Because I was a little bit in doubt when this whole thing started. Is it going to go in the spiritual, in the religious way, or? But I can see now it's more of a philosophical nature. But is this your presentation? Is this like a PhD that you are that you're currently presenting on a university, or that you've already gone through with, or because I'm also considering myself a future in psychedelics. I really love psychedelics. You know, I would love to work with them professionally, but I'm a teacher, yeah. Maybe you can comment on some of that. What I said.
Yeah, no, I actually have my Viva Voce in 2 days' time. So yeah, I'm almost finished. So I'll have my I'll have my PhD, hopefully with minor corrections, fingers crossed. In 3 months to submit afterwards. So yeah, I'm nearly there. But yeah, no, it's very much a philosophical approach. Like the PhD is in the philosophy department, but I'm always of the mind. I think it was the Irish philosopher Eugenia, who was echoing Augustine when he said true philosophy is true religion and true religion is true philosophy. You can't have one without the other. So they're not mutually exclusive as far as I'm concerned. As far as because the self-transforming machine elves, and whether they have reality or not, I think it depends entirely on the person undergoing the experience, essentially, because you were talking about indigenous people and then conversing or discussing with animal spirits and nature spirits and so on. Which,
I compare it to the DMT entities. It's very common for people. There's a study made with over 2,000 people, who experienced these entities after smoking DMT, and it was like only 9% of the people involved. They thought these things only happened in their own mind, but the rest was actually convinced these beings existed in some kind of alternate reality. Some of them are like spiritual helpers or like guides or even angels, and they give people missions or reveal things to them about their own life, what they should do. And so is it real or is it not? It's a sensitive area.
Yeah. I mean, again, I need to do more research specific to those areas, but I think my view of psychedelic realism can definitely incorporate and facilitate those sort of worldviews as well, where you can affirm that these things are real. You're in touch with some sort of archetype or platonic form, which is giving you some sort of information or something that something is being revealed to you. Because I do think that rather than Pollen's concerned that it's a delusion, I think psychedelics are actually revelatory. It just depends on the degree, depends on case by case basis. So the individual, their background, so on and so forth.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much, and good luck with the presentation.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Yeah.
So Warren, is this the next question?
Hi. One thing that I was, thank you for a super stimulating talk. One thing that I was thinking about as you were going through the section about perception and cognitive penetration, and then a little bit of the inroads from psychological evidence that bear on your account. It made me think about these predictive processing models of perception that have gained a pretty strong foothold in the neuroscientific research on psychedelics, and also increasing amounts of research on like the neural correlates of advanced meditative states. And one thing that I think is interesting there is that in these very heightened psychedelic states, as well as very heightened states of meditation, like very late stage states of meditation, there's a reduction in the top-down cognitive activity that cognitively penetrates perception, and that you have a very detailed mechanistic account for cognitive penetration and perception with predictive processing, whereby psychedelics actually dampen that cognitive penetration. And I think that I would be really curious to see how your argument interlaces with that evidence in a way that still fits your Platonist metaphysics, I think is possible, and it could be like really interesting.
Sorry, Warren, my laptop died just when you started your question, so I'm on my phone now, so I missed the start of your question. Sorry about that. Could you repeat it, please?
Sure. So I guess I'm curious if like maybe more buried in your thesis, if you have engaged with the predictive processing or predictive coding models of perception that give some evidence in like the neuroimaging research around psychedelics and meditation of a dampening of this top-down activity in the brain that's driven by like prior expectations and allows more direct sensory evidence to reach perception. Because I think that there's some consilience there between the argument you're making and the science that might help. And I'm super curious to see how that fits within like your Platonist metaphysics.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with some of the predictive processing approaches. There's the Rebus, which is Robin Carhart Harris's paper. I'm slightly wary because the main distinction is, I think, is for predictive processing. You're very much working with a representational theory of perception, whereas I think perception is direct. I think you're actually perceiving the world. I'm not just perceiving a representation of the world. Because any representational theory is implying a duality of objects. Because if I was a representationalist, I'd be looking at this phone right now. So according for a representationalist, there has to be the phone, which exists externally, and then there has to be the representation of the phone as well. So there's an implied duality of objects, and also there's this like sort of air gap between me and reality if I'm a representationalist, because I'm never directly perceiving reality. I'm always just perceiving a representation of reality. So I've a slight problem with, I need to do more research into predictive processing to see if there are any direct realist approaches. But then you mentioned meditation as well. Yeah, I think there's quite a few papers on the links between psychedelic experience and meditation. And that seems to relax the default mode network, or temporarily take it offline. Actually, there's a book, I got an email about it yesterday by a chap called Aidan Lyons. It's either Lion or Lions, I'm not too sure. But he's based, I think, in Amsterdam, and he has a book coming out next year with Oxford University Press called Psychedelic Experience, where he's essentially arguing that that meditation is a psychedelic experience, and he's looking at the links between the two. So that might be something you'd be interested in as well.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's inspiring me to dig into the possibility that predictive processing can be formulated without representationalism. Definitely.
Yeah, look into it. Yeah, if you find an answer, be sure to let me know.
Okay.
Alexandra, questions next.
Hello, and thank you again for this amazing overview of research you've done from around 1900 until right now. I observed that we are in a really interesting method and theory discussion and phase again with new ontologies, and I see your work a little bit in that area. I pick up on a few points the others have already raised. In the study of religion, there was a lot of criticism of the phenomenology of religion because the question, can we decide about the ontology? Yeah, is the spirit world true or not? And position ourselves within the natural scientific worldview, whatever that is, and is it true what we study? It brought us to the decision, or to the possibility, to study things without deciding that. And for good reasons, because Romanticism has kind of created this universal idea of saving religion through philosophical argumentation, right? So I'm really interested in how we can bring the arguments together, and I'm not sure whether I've understood your last slide. Are you going beyond people like the theologian Schleiermacher, who made the point that if we experience something so intense and so elaborate, then there must be something that we experience. And I mean, correlating this now with the last speaker, with more recent philosophy of mind, going beyond kind of speculation in early phenomenology, I'm really curious, what is your argument? Because you're making the claim, that we can decide the ontology here, not saying we need to take seriously what people experience and that it is serious for them or us when we are participant observers. But are you going beyond that claim to say, yeah, but if it's so intense, and if, where do you make the argument for your last claim, which was really, there is a fog, and that's very metaphorical, a fog of the ego, and then something is revealed, which is in itself a mystical expression, right?
Yeah, I mean, throughout my thesis, I'm sort of advocating a perennial philosophy, that there is a mind-independent source for all religious feelings and religious experiences. And then I'm also relating that to Max Scheler's late anthropology, where he offers, philosophical argumentation, step by step, which essentially culminates in the perennialist worldview that, well, the point of us being here is for the universe to grasp and realize itself, which, it's quite a religious claim for a philosopher to be making. So yeah, like I'm saying that there is a mind-independent, objective, atemporal source to all of everything, essentially. But I'm like, again, like, it's because the problem that I've had throughout this thesis is that there's so many like epistemic tributaries that you can get lost down. It's just like, it's what sort of, what's the metaphysics that I'm going to use? What's the epistemological object that I'm directed towards? So I've tried very hard just to keep it focused on phenomenology for now, and then that'll, over time, will open up to include more detailed examination of what specific, like, is there a hierarchy of essences, like Plotinus would have argued? You go, step by step until you, apprehend the one, to use Plotinus's term. Which, and again, to return to Max Scheler, he wrote some interesting stuff about love. I think love is actually the next important point of call for any examination or philosophical examination of the psychedelic experience, because I think that's probably the most important, not philosophical lessons, it's the most important experience that any human can have, is the experience of love. And what is that? Is the essence of love. Because I want to try to give validity, not just to the psychedelic experience, but also to that sort of platitudinous report that people have after psychedelic experiences when they say, I took mushrooms and I realized everything is love and everything's made out of love. And it sounds like some sort of like classless Hallmark card when you say it in ordinary states of perception. But I want to try to give some sort of, forthright philosophical validity to claims like that, because I think that my project so far has kind of opened the door to that, and I just need to push love through the door, essentially.
Interesting that you're mentioning love, because we just had a discussion about, in the same framework, about hate.
Okay, interesting.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So thanks, Danny. We've run over time. I'm sure we could keep the discussion going. I know there are many interesting avenues, but I think we should end it here, because Danny is going to be interrogated again and asked lots of questions in a few days' time. So thanks again, Danny.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Stop the recording.
Thanks very much. If anyone has any, other questions, I'm very happy to answer any emails. But yeah, thank you very much, guys. Thanks for all the questions.